I was born in The Hague, in the Netherlands, in 1956. I was the eldest of three. My sister was born 2.5 years after me, my brother 10 years later. My parents, my mom was trained as a school teacher. Once she got married, she quit her job, or maybe she was asked to quit her job. My dad was an architect. I would say they were both born in the Netherlands in 1931. The most intense experience in their lives was World War II. And all through my childhood and young adulthood, I just remember always sort of hearing anecdotes and stories and details and sometimes just attitudes about what happened then and Germany and Germans. They both lived through the German occupation from 1940 to 1945. We don't have sort of, we just came from nowhere, basically. I think my mother's family lived in the north of North Holland. Her dad was a small dairy farmer. My dad grew up in a suburb north of Amsterdam, where his dad had an office job. Politically, my parents leaned left. My mother a bit more than my dad. My mother was a pacifist, and that influenced me a lot. My dad was more like middle of the road labor, I think, or the Dutch version of that at the time. Religiously, they were unreligious. I would say they were atheists, but they raised us with respect for other people's religion. Ethically, that sort of being moral, doing the right thing was very important to them. I think in the Netherlands, from the 50s till the 70s, that was just a very common story. I mean, the war was this big shadow over every aspect of society. I mean, people were divided in like who was good during the war, who was bad. That was that simple.
Meaning who had collaborated?
Who had collaborated versus who was in the resistance. And of course, the majority of people did neither. But it was sort of, it was considered as a very black and white. You were either on this side or on that side. And it drove Dutch politics. It was pretty uneventful, very sort of middle class. My parents sort of started out relatively poor, but with relatively good education. They had both finished high school and done some follow-on education. So my mother had trained to be a teacher. My dad, there's one detail I forgot. My dad refused to join the army. And as a result, he spent some time in prison, and he spent some time in various work camps, sort of making up for his opinion on that, in that area. He sort of, I guess at the time, the Dutch political spectrum was divided in all these different political parties, where there was the sort of the labor in the middle, and then to the left of it were ever smaller and more left-leaning parties, one of which was sort of stated to be a pacifist party. And so, but yeah, in sort of, in the general sense, my parents both were very much sick and tired of the violence of the war. and sort of took a stance. I wasn't born yet. That
Oh.
all happened before I was born. When I was born, I think he was taking evening classes to become sort of a licensed architect, and he had a day job as a draftsperson at an architectural firm. And so gradually, we moved to a different city. We moved to a different house in The Hague. With sort of, when I was born, it was this like, they rented 2 rooms in a kind of a shabby neighborhood, and then they moved to a flat in a newer neighborhood. Then they moved to a different city where my dad got a better job at an architectural firm, but then he had sort of got all his papers. And he was quite good at his work, and sort of things just gradually got better. Finally, they bought a house, then they bought another house. And I went to university. My sister went to music school, conservatory. My little brother went to art school. We were sort of good middle class people with no sort of real connections, or that there was like, it felt like we one generation before we came from the mud. Well, it was pretty consistent. It was all like either row houses or 4-story apartment buildings. That was sort of the neighborhood where I grew up. I think when I was in high school, at some point we moved much closer downtown, and we lived in an older neighborhood, but it was still like all row houses. That's sort of how most neighborhoods in the Netherlands are organized. Well, the first thing I remember was when I was around 10, I got an electronics kit, I think for a birthday. And I was super excited about that. And all through high school, I sort of was an electronics hobbyist. And I was not very good at soldering, actually, but I was good at designing circuits. So I sort of went in the direction of ever more complicated digital circuits. That was my main hobby, and I had a somewhat related hobby, which was building mechanical models. But the electronics, I think I enjoyed more. I didn't really do sports, didn't do a whole lot of outdoor stuff, although our parents always dragged us out to various parks for walks and hikes on weekends and bike rides. We watched a moderate amount of TV. I think my parents were initially, when we were small, they were pretty against it. And there were like 2 channels in the Netherlands. Eventually, I think at some point my dad got really old TV that one of his colleagues was throwing out, but it still worked, but they only received 1 channel. We read a lot of books, Dutch literature, foreign literature, always in Dutch translation. We listened to music on the radio. Yeah, I developed my musical taste listening to sort of, I don't know, that these days you would call it alternative rock or something on Dutch radio. But there were only a few radio channels, and a lot of the music was like horrible popular music, as I thought about it at the time. A lot of the sort of interesting music came from the United States. I remember very occasionally reading some science fiction stories, but at the time it was not really a thing. I was always good at learning. All the material, whether it was languages or art or science or math, all they came easy. I did my homework very quickly. I always aced all the tests. I didn't have a lot of friends, and I was very nerdy myself. The only people who sort of wanted to hang out with me were the other nerdy kids, not the other kids who were also sort of at the top of the class. I remember hanging out with a few other kids who were electronics hobbyists. But I sort of socially, I didn't have a lot of friends. I really was. I mean, I think I loved my science teachers most, and especially my physics teacher. My math teacher was also very good. I also loved Dutch literature. Sadly, I couldn't get along with history very well, so I dropped that as a subject. And I think of all the sciences, chemistry interested me least. Because the way it was being taught was like memorizing large tables of apparently randomly chosen numbers. And that was not my skill. My skills were always like, given two basic rules, I could derive everything else I needed to solve a problem from just from basics. But the basics, the way that works in chemistry sort of didn't work for me. Yeah, I think for a few seconds I played with the idea of doing something completely different, like studying Dutch literature. I'm very glad I didn't do that. I would probably have been terrible at that. I didn't know much about what it was to study any particular subject at university. In the Netherlands, they make you choose a major when you sort of enter. So it was like, you could choose to go study chemistry or physics or math. Or there were 5 other sort of scientific branches. So I chose math because I enjoyed the topic. I think my physics teacher was a little disappointed. In the end, it turned out that the first year was mostly a repetition of the math I had already sort of mostly understood during high school. And then during high school, I had been working ahead. So I had done like every possible math topic that was taught in my high school. But after that first year, it turned out that the real math I wasn't particularly good at. And I think there were some great teachers at that university and some super cool topics being taught, and I couldn't keep up. I remember something about a particular form of group theory, and I knew a few other students who were like, oh, you gotta go do graph theory or group theory, and I was like, went way too fast, and I suddenly realized I didn't have the skills to sort of keep up with those topics. But in the meantime, starting almost from my first month, I entered the math department. I had been learning to program because they had like one of the first year undergraduate courses was programming in Pascal. It was sort of taught by one of the professors in the math department, I believe. But it was taught, I think there were like 300 people or so. I've only got a few memories, but I do remember that there was a programming course and Pascal was the language, but I also remembered that there were other languages that were also accessible on the mainframe. And I learned Algol 60 basically just by going to the library and borrowing the reference manual or just sort of studying it there.
Class and then maybe some other classes?
The way it was done was each student was given an account, and the account had a certain value, and you would use a card punch to write your program, and you would combine that with a special card that identified your account. And then your job, you gave your deck of punch cards to the computer operator, and they put it in the computer, and it entered into some kind of queue, and at some point your job was run, and then the printout with the errors came out, and there was like a system of cubby holes and numbers where you would get your output. And the Pascal compiler took like a fraction of a second to compile my little program and tell me what was wrong with it. So that student account was worth probably hundreds of little batch jobs like that. So during a semester, I could experiment quite a bit and sort of learn a lot, and sort of it was just completely up to me. Do I try to learn Pascal, Algol, Fortran? And I hung out in the basement where the sort of mainframe access was, enough that I met other students who had similar interests, including more senior students who had more experience, and some people who had part-time jobs there. And I think that sort of prepared me for that job I got myself in my third. Exchanging programming tips, and sort of we were always debating, well, Algol versus Pascal, or Algol or Fortran, which is better? And all the physicists said, oh, Fortran is much easier. And the mathematicians amongst the programmers said, no, Algol 60, it's designed with block structure in it, or simple language.
Around this period?
I did not. Yeah, I think by then he had moved to Eindhoven, where he worked for a different university, and I didn't actually know the names of any of the luminaries. I read the Algol 60 reference manual, which was actually it was the original sort of language definition. Actually, it was very formal, very dry. It had 12 or 20 authors on the cover, but I didn't recognize any of those names, and also none of them stood out. The only language where I remember the name, because it was like one or two people, was the Pascal manual, where the manual was a much thicker book, because it was actually an introduction to programming and an sort of more explanatory rather than just a language definition. And so from that I remember Kathleen Jensen and Niklaus Wirth. And I assume that Kathleen Jensen was like the sort of the educational person, and Wirth was the sort of language design genius. Eventually, I think in '89, I attended a talk given by Wirth in Palo Alto. Actually, I think I have to revise what I said before a little bit. I think maybe my first year I learned Algol, and my second year somehow suddenly the departmental staff were recommending students learn Pascal instead. So I can't say I preferred Algol over Pascal. I think it was more the other way around. I mean, I had never really sort of liked the Fortran side. I mean, I sort of had tried it a little bit, but Algol 60 was much more sort of the language I initially chose. But then once I discovered Pascal, there were a number of little details in Pascal, and maybe it had to do with sort of how the language was expressed on punched cards. It was still mostly punched cards. That just felt like, oh, this is much easier. Because in Algol 60, you have to type begin, end, and every time you type begin, at least in the version of the compiler we had, you had to type double quotes around it. And I think on an IBM card punch, that's even a sort of a somewhat awkward position. So in Pascal, they just did away with the quotes or strops, I think they were called, around the keywords of the language. And it was a compromise because it meant you couldn't have a variable name to begin, and the Algo people were always very proud that they could have sort of the keywords were not impinging on the variable names and function names and so on. It turns out that is absolutely not a problem. And Pascal was just the first language where I sort of encountered that little language design detail. Well, I think the first 2 years I actually lived at home and I commuted to university by train. There was like a 15-minute train ride plus a, 10-minute bus ride on one side and a 15-minute bike ride on the other or something. I didn't have much of a university life except that during lunch break, I often hung out in the basement where the mainframe was, or the access to the mainframe was. The actual mainframe was across town. It was a sort of infamously ugly, 15-story building in a fairly historic part of Amsterdam. I think the staff of the math department didn't like their location very much, but for me, that was all I knew, and Amsterdam was a big city, and after 2 years, my dad said, "Oh, you're old enough to live on your own," and I moved to a dorm, and after a year, I moved to a dorm that was in the center of town, and that's where I stayed until I graduated. So I had friends, not a lot. I had some friends outside university. I had joined a club that sort of popularizes the study of nature, like ornithology, bird watching, identifying plants, environmentalism. I had a lot of friends in that community, and sort of every Sunday we would go on a bike ride and sort of spot the birds and look at the plants. And then in summer there were some summer camps. What I remember from university, classrooms. The best part was actually after I took that job, I realized that there was a second university in Amsterdam where the computer science program was much better. I think the department was led by Andrew S. Tannenbaum, and he had a bunch of other good teachers, and he was raising his own crop of PhD students. And it turns out that sort of the computer classes, the programming classes I got at the University of Amsterdam in the math department were sort of a pretty haphazard collection of topics that didn't interest me. I mean, sometimes the topics interested me. I mean, I remember one semester we were all learning Algol 68, and the teacher was super excited, but other times it was like numerical programming, calculating what the error is after a certain set of matrix operations, and I was not interested in anything involving floating point numbers, basically. But Tannenbaum or his group taught topics like operating systems, databases, networks, and languages, I believe. Yeah, Tannenbaum himself did a class where he taught like 7 non-mainstream programming languages. And that was all, I just soaked that up. And somehow the two universities had an arrangement where students could just take classes at the other university for points. Minix is known from a major sort of spat between Tannenbaum and Linus Torvalds. The two were actually independent and very differently oriented sort of descendants from Unix.
Right.
And Tannenbaum had a particular philosophy about making everything small and elegant. And Linus was just sort of hacking around without much particular sort of sense for what is the right way of doing things. And that, yeah, I think there's a very, very famous or infamous debate that went on in the very early days of Linux. But yeah, 10x developed Minix. That was actually, I think he did that after I had graduated.
Oh, okay.
But I ended up eventually sort of working on a group that was collaborating with Tannenbaum's team. I say that the sort of not that much. I was pretty sort of. I was basically just studying whatever I wanted. There was one professor, Van M. de Boas, who sort of occasionally sort of encouraged me, pushed me in certain directions. I think that's the only name I really remember. I ended up my degree, and I think they sort of customized it a little bit for my situation, was in mathematics and computer science. There was essentially a math degree. Van M. de Boas sort of helped me sort of make sure that I graduated, because that at some point the job and other programming things were much more fun than studying.
Right.
It was not really a computer lab. It was actually sort of a service organization.
Oh, okay, right.
The sort of, I think in the past the computers had been very sort of rare, and I think there was some trauma in the sort of attempts to develop their own computer, and at some point the university decided that they needed a mainframe, and it turned out that mainframes were so expensive that they actually sort of, the two universities in Amsterdam plus a place that a research lab that was called the Mathematical Center, which did a lot of specific computer science and sort of related math research. The three of them got together and bought a control data mainframe. I'm sure it took them years to actually decide which brand to buy, especially to decide to not buy IBM. I think the control data mainframe excelled in sort of numerical computations. It had superior floating point performance. Anyway, so the sort of, there was a separate entity that ran the mainframe and was supposed to sort of give everyone equal access and keep track of bookkeeping, making sure that everybody sort of paid for the time they used on the computer. And that was the entity that sort of employed me. It was, at the time it was called SARA, Stichting Academisch Rekencentrum Amsterdam. It's like the foundation for the academical compute center in Amsterdam. And their physical location initially was with the Free University of Amsterdam, which was like where Tannenbaum was also teaching. Yeah, so the operating systems group, I think, was responsible for most of the sysadmin work. The actual the operating system was produced by Control Data, and I mean, you paid for the hardware and all the software was free. So the compilers were also produced by Control Data, CDC. What we did do was write sort of additional software. For example, there was accounting software that was customized, and there were integrations, and we were responsible for installing third-party software and keeping the compilers and the operating system up to date. And I remember there was like this row of shelves from here to the back wall of computer printout that was, I think, refreshed like weekly or monthly. That was the complete source code for the operating system, so that if something went wrong, you could actually look up what had happened. My role was to sort of write small utility tools and help with sort of odd tasks. And eventually that included implementing a sort of simplified programming language that supported control flow in the very arcane job control language that CDC used. A bit. The sort of not at all to the extent that it existed in places like MIT at the time. I was completely unaware of any of that. But there were a few other people, including a few other part-time employed students at that place who were not just doing it for work, but also passionate about the topic. And we were sort of exchanging stories and learning together. And there was a group of passionate users, and sometimes there was an adversarial sort of relationship. There were like users who were trying to break through the accounting system so they could get free or unlimited access of the software, and the system people then had to sort of plug the holes. But it's at some point, the group of people was small enough, and the computer wasn't really on any kind of network. There was no truly anonymous access. So at some point, I remember the head of the accounting department just talking to one of the persistent little hackers who was one of the very, very bright students, who was just sort of thought it was great fun to break into that system and crash it. And the head of the accounting department was tired of that and just had a sort of, I think he threatened with physical violence. He didn't apply any, but he said, if you keep doing this, if you do that particular trick again, I will hurt you. It's the sort of that I wasn't there, but that's the story I heard at the time.